Rob McCaskill wrote me this morning, and this is a continuation of the series of the dialogue between me and Rob. Uh, Making Sausage with Rob McCaskill, 12/20/19. Thoughts on Catholicism, comedy, and writing. Yeah, Rob wrote me at 9:18 a.m. Central Time on December the 20th. Is that the right date? Yes, December the 20th. I've been thinking something close to what you wrote about the removal of optimism. I like the shocking severity of seeing that in print. This is Rob, right? The similar prospect in my mind is the thought of perceiving more tragedy, to have the hue of loss more present in everyday, ongoing eyesight. Perhaps a tragic awareness can weave with a factual confidence. In one of Dave Chappelle's most recent specials, he said at the top of his set that he might not do stand up much longer because it's too easy. He said, I was sitting backstage just now and thought, oh, yeah, this is going to go very well. Of course, it's going to go well. You're talented and put in decades of practice. That is an optimism. It's being real with oneself instead of employing a childhood strategy of fear. If I predict the worst, someone will rescue me. Visiting my mother-in-law for Thanksgiving, I looked at the spines on her bookshelf. There were 2 or 3 books about art, but another volume pulled my gaze, a leather cover. It was a daily missal, soft, a ribbon marking a page. I flipped through, spotting familiar stories and prayers, the phases of the year. Read recently that at one time the poets Robert Lowell and John Berryman both converted to Catholicism. Berryman's wife did too. A scholarly friend asked Mrs. Berryman, I understand why those two converted. They want the metaphors. But why did you? The metaphors. I wondered if I could go back to church and embrace involvement as a poetic metaphor. The vestments, gospels, architecture, sacraments, all perceived as enticements to the mind to feel a deeper sense of loss. And in that, a deeper confidence. All religions work, I believe, in bringing the mind to prophetic awareness. It's just that most practitioners circumvent the process, holding on to prosaic status. But the thought of Mass sours me, the thought of conservatism, the baggage of my own childhood misconceptions, may be too much to overcome. Maybe the metaphor's in me already and only needs a touch. And I answered at 10:11 a.m. on December 20th, that's Central Time. Rob, I love this letter. I love the writing. I was fascinated that we were separated for years and had such a similar frame of reference. Baldwin and Bloom come to mind. The congruity continues. I wrote a segment quite a bit ago, Stand-Up Comedy is Dead. It was inspired by Chappelle getting into choppy waters over something he said. I wrote that he was failed by the form. The easiness he talks about is a great limitation. I try to write post-genre. The story and theme should dictate the tone, not some external construct. Have you read Václav Havel? He's great regarding the superiority of hope over optimism. I love how you introduce confidence here and redefine what it means in action, associating it with tragedy. I was talking to Paula last night about my childhood antipathy to Protestantism. Raised Catholic, I couldn't see why they reformed the church by removing the art. I have also determined to keep my Catholicism unmediated by the church. Years ago, I read quite a bit about John Paul II, a real mixed bag of a religious leader. I didn't engage him as a priest, but rather as a very interesting writer. Art and religion occupy the same field in my view. I prefer art because it is more personal and because it makes no claims of material authority. What is true has authority, not an organization telling one how to behave. So much of who I am is still the Catholic boy in a Jesuit high school. We had a rector who said, "We're not here to demand that you believe in God. It is our job to make you think about the existence of God." Now that's faith. Conservatism sours me too, strikes me as elaborate rationalizations for fear and resistance to the natural transformations of existence. All of my comments here basically reflect what you wrote so beautifully. Your letter resonated deeply with me. You might be interested in reading Stand Up Comedy is Dead. Here's the link. What I'm going to do right now is I'm going to read it. Stand Up Comedy is Dead as part of this piece. If you do want to look for this piece, here's the easiest way, because obviously on a YouTube clip, you know, reading the link to you is kind of lost. But if you Google Stand Up Comedy is Dead in quotation marks, the Rick blog in quotation marks, you can pull it up, you know. One other thing too, the date is wrong, as I'm sure that many of you will identify with, filling in checks in January, because the date is listed as 1/4/17, but actually this was written in 1/4/18. Okay, let me pull this up now. Here we go. 1/4/18. Stand-up comedy is dead. Dave Chappelle is being criticized for a recent comedy performance. People feel that they are disrespected by what he said. For purposes of this piece, the nature of their grievances hardly matter. The problem is not only in the alleged grievances against the performer. It lies in the form itself. I know two changes in the nature of post-World War II stand-up comedy in the US, and now we are on the cusp of a third. I'm sure there are more changes, and I could write about them, I suppose, but I will discuss what is relevant to the piece that I'm writing here. Starting point: seltzer bottles and mugging. Immediately after World War II, comedians were just silly. Broad slapstick antics, shrill voices, lots of making faces. Milton Berle was the most prominent, and Jerry Lewis was the last of this breed, and probably also the most prominent. I think he transcended Berle. In all of this discussion, I will use big stars as a means of illustration. The scores of other performers in each era work primarily in the same way. Also, I won't discuss people who work in a manner before their time, so no digressions about Lord Buckley and the like. My purpose is to make a cultural observation here, not to critique individual comedians. Inflection point one: the emergence of sophistication. A new kind of comedian emerged in the mid-1950s. The Compass Players and early Second City were a large part of this development. Compass and Second City were not stand-up operations, but they spawned some revolutionary stand-ups. Comedy became intelligent and satiric. Bob Newhart, Shelley Berman, Nichols and May, Woody Allen, Jonathan Winters, Robert Klein, David Steinberg were comedians who were very smart about cultural and political matters and human psychology. They made sharp observations, but were not agents of social change. They made ironic comments about what most in their audience agreed was an imperfect but pretty good world, all in all. Of course, prophets also worked in this time, like Lenny Bruce and Dick Gregory, but those comics were also before their time. Inflection point two: the time of paradox, comedians as rock stars and as leaders of social change. The incredible success of Saturday Night Live was an earthquake in comedy. John Belushi and Dan Aykroyd filmed the Blues Brothers in Chicago when I was on the main stage at Second City. They came and hung out around the theater for a brief time during the shooting of that show and soon opened a private club of their own across the street. They were as popular as the Beatles. Something was lost in this transition. Comedians in any era were always about comedy in any era was always about lovable losers who struggled. Comedy, Charlie Chaplin in 1940's Bob Hope, was a representation of humanity as a giant collective fool who, by dint of love or resourcefulness or some other positive human characteristic, prevailed in spite of all its human faults and frailties. That changed with SNL. Comedians now were people of power. They were rich and had a voice. SNL stars largely used that power to be rich, famous, popular. SNL was all about success. Yes, SNL stars weren't stand ups generally, but they had a great influence on how the audience perceived stand ups. Steve Martin's mega popularity in the mid 70s was the stand up equivalent to SNL, a stand up who filled basketball arenas. And of course, he appeared often on SNL. The more interesting development at this cultural moment came out of what two stand ups did for example, remember using famous examples, what two stand ups, for example, did with their fame and power. Richard Pryor and George Carlin used stand up as a means to be artists and to assert cultural, political, and moral leadership through their comedy, which was unfailingly hilarious. This tone in comedy marked the high water mark of stand up as an art form. Okay, the next stage, the age of repetition. And then comedy stayed the same for years. This isn't unusual in any way. Stand up trends were like trends in popular music. A great revolutionary sound emerges Sinatra, Elvis, the Beatles, etc. And then we listen to it from many artists for a few generations until something new happens. Some superficial formal changes happen, but nothing essentially transforms. There has been no transformation in improvisation either as a performance form. The biggest changes in improv has come in its applications, mainly in the field of education and in its popularity, particularly as a participatory activity. People seem more interested in improvising themselves than in watching it. New formal changes occur in improv as in music, the herald, long form, blah, blah, blah. Each generation thinks they've done something different and chauvinistically think they do it better, when really no one has ever fundamentally changed or improved upon what Paul Sills and David Shepard were up to at the Compass in the 1950s. I can't help but digress here. Improvisers should pick up their game in that regard. Viola Spolin said the soul of improvisation is revolution and transformation. She said improvisation should turn into something new. It certainly has for individuals who have become writers, actors, directors, CEOs, etc., after a good training in improvisation. But the form itself can be much more. Improvisers either revere the past in an unhealthy way, of course, the founder should be honored, or compete with the past and claim superiority to it when their actual work demonstrates very little to support that claim. So in the age of repetition, we have big stand-up stars today, like Stephen Colbert, for example. He does monologues, if you are balking at that classification, that have a social consciousness. But like all Xerox copies, all repetitions are a bit faded. Colbert is famous, but not like the Beatles or the Blues Brothers were. Colbert has power, but not like Pryor or Carlin. He has a corporate job, not a totally unfettered voice. Colbert doesn't exert the leadership of Pryor or Carlin either. He's limited to having some of his sharply pointed jokes, real social comments, presented as a sideshow on the news. He is not dangerous like Pryor or Carlin. People actually changed after listening to those guys. None of this is Colbert's fault. He's doing what he can with this cultural moment, or at least this commercial moment. Which brings us back to Dave Chappelle. Stand up comedy is dead. Chappelle missed with his recent comments because he is fiercely holding on to a form which is no longer viable. He wants to communicate only through the joke. It's what he identifies with. The joke is a literary form born of oppression. Good jokes make fun of the powerful. Bad jokes mock the weak. The joke has always been an instrument of near justice. The joke has always been a way of dealing with injustice, not the answer to it. Pryor and Carlin awakened outrage, and that was a huge change. Outrage is necessary for personal and social change as a first step. But now we are past the time of prophecy. The collective soul is screaming for justice. People don't want to just mitigate their suffering. They want to end it. And the times are complex. We all have some oppressed and some oppressor within us at the moment. We allowed our politics and culture to get to this promising moment of crisis. The joke can be part of a presentation to an audience, but it doesn't work as the whole thing. The consciousness of the world has made a big leap in the past 2 years, and stand-up comedy is a casualty of that leap. Things have to be destroyed in order to create the new. I had a 19-year-old kid work as my stage manager on the last iteration of my show, which was titled The Death of a Nation. Even he would admit he has a lot to learn about stage managing and maybe won't pursue it. He's a good young composer and musician. But he brought a wonderful spirit to the show. He gave me one of the most instructive comments that I have heard about my work. He said, "I love how the show can be very funny and then become very serious and intense. I love how the show can be very political and then get very personal. You tell jokes, make poetry, analyze things, teach, and tell a lot of stories. There are all sorts of characters. It's moving and thought-provoking. It works on so many levels." The 19-year-old is the voice of the future. I had a director for that show, a very nice guy. When I get back to the letter, my return email to Rob, I kind of regret this. This guy was not a bad guy, but I wouldn't describe him as nice. I don't think, so let's edit that short line out of here now. We mutually decided not to continue to work together. I am immune to direction. Yeah, I'm a writer. I mean, I just write. I really don't want to be directed. Said, I'm immune to direction. I can only do what feels true to me. So I listen to people, but ultimately I do what I want. I'm sure this was very frustrating for my director friend. And I wouldn't call him my friend either. Not a bad guy, but really not my friend. Not bad, but not nice. The writer is primary in my world. From now on, I will direct myself. There is power in that. I had power in my last show too, but too much unnecessary arguing. Story of my life, being told to do something which goes against my deepest beliefs leads to legitimate rebellion. When I am dead and put in the ground, no director will go in the hole with me. The director, to his credit, said as much when we started. I mean, he wasn't a fool. He saw this coming. But we tried, and I got a lot out of it, and I thank him for that. We had a major creative difference. The director thinks stand-up is still alive. He mentioned a stand-up that he admired, Paul F. Tompkins, as someone who is very aware of everything happening in the room when he works. I wasn't sure as to why he brought Tompkins up. And I think that's a strength of mine as well. So why am I looking at Tompkins? I mean, I didn't get it. Now, I'd seen a little of Tompkins on TV, but I really didn't know his work. So I looked him up on YouTube. I only lasted for about 3 minutes as I watched Tompkins. I thought his act was excrement. And I'm not criticizing Tompkins, or I guess I am, but I mean, I hated the show because stand-up is dead. and particularly and bad stand up is really a stinking corpse. I mean, it's insufferable. Tompkins wasn't present in the room. He had some arch affected, calculated persona that was inauthentic. His tone was defined by what he thought people would find funny. Tompkins started talking about a funeral that he attended in a very superficial way. He was trying to shock and trying to be glib. The only thing the writer performer standing on stage in front of people should be going for is exploration of the truth. Period. I wasn't offended by Tompkins. I just felt it was a waste of time. And I had moments in my show as recently as July 2017 that resembled Tompkins' inauthentic manner. I had this idea that I would organize my show in 3 acts: stand up, analysis, story, and poetry. That's what I was experimenting with. But that didn't work either. A piece has its own creative logic. I started the Rick blog with the idea that at last I could unleash all of the disparate parts of my personality on the world. And I keep getting better at doing that. Genre is a trap. My friend, the director, not my friend, the director, who was very generous with his time through most of the experience, understandably lost interest at the end of our common project. I was still at a point where I was being overly generous in my assessment of the guy. And I'll talk more about what really happened when I get back to the letter, the email with Rob. That's more than okay. It's really not okay. I mean, it's okay in the sense that everything's okay. It was good to oppose his ideas. Well, that's true, you know, but all it did was confirm my truths and dispose of his ideas. Art needs openings and obstructions to form itself, and that's true. So everything's grist for the mill. So the process, the struggle, rah rah rah. One thing I tried to do was go to storytelling and stand-up venues in order to polish segments of the show. The director encouraged me to continue to do so. That direction received an emphatic no. He accused me of repeating myself in this negative, but in my defense, he kept bringing it up. I really disliked those stand-up storytelling shows. I would never go listen to them as audience. And in playing them, I felt like a jazz musician appearing with the Archies. For you younger people, the Archies was a synthetic rock group that was made to play bubblegum music for a cartoon in the 1970s. I went to one show and people balked at the fact that there were moments of anger in my set. They didn't like the anger. I was told to be more like a woman who told a story about fucking a rock star at a concert when she was young. These problems with anger, you have to understand. I was doing a lot of political stuff there, and it was the political moment of where you saw this autocratic consolidation, this fascist revolution that's been going on in this country. So we're going back to late 2017. And I think not being outraged, it's ridiculous. I mean, I got up in front of the audience. I said, before I was introduced, I said, this guy's political, but we all have different points of view, and all the points of view are respected and welcome at this particular venue. And I began my set by saying, I'd like to thank all of you who voted for Donald Trump for fucking up the world. So apparently they found that off-putting. I don't know. I went to one show that demanded strict time limits. This was ridiculous. This place, it's called the Shithole, and it's this floating performance venue. And they keep you austerely to a 5 minute time limit. I've always hated that. To me, that completely echoes, at least for my generation, it echoes television. The show has a prescribed amount of time, and they have to keep to that time. And why do they keep to that time? Because time is money, literally, and they sell the time. Now, a piece runs as long as it has to run. I mean, as a teacher, a lot of times I say, yeah, it's important to be concise, but students use and I think so-called artists and performers do too. They use being concise in quotes as an excuse to be shallow, so they don't really cover the material. And what was interesting is at the end of this show, when we had all these strict time limits, I looked around at the people in the audience and the people in the whole scene there, and it didn't seem like anybody was doing anything that was so fucking important that that more time couldn't be required. So it turns everything into marketing because you're just getting out there, to be seen. Now, time limits are a good exercise, but I'm beyond that. And I say here more concisely, I guess. A piece should be concise, I guess, but its length should really be determined by its content. I always felt uncomfortable and pissed off at these shows because of their superficiality. Most of the acts, let me say 90% of the acts, were pretty dumb. And you might think that I didn't get laughs at these venues given what you might perceive to be the bitterness of my observations. That's another thing too. The way I wrote this line originally was, you might think that I didn't get laughs at these venues given the bitterness of my observations. But my observations are not bitter. It has nothing to do with being bitter. Bitter about what? I mean, bitter at not being a regular in the 5 minute lineup at the Shithole. Here's the reality of what happened. I killed, actually. I got big laughs. I was a very popular act. Like Rob says about Dave Chappelle, it was easy. I don't have to prepare. When I was teaching improvisation specifically related to Second City style sketch comedy, I said basically when people were improvising, I said, getting a laugh should be like a musician being able to carry a tune, to hit a note. You should be able to get a laugh at will if you're a comedian. That's what Dave Chappelle is saying. If you're a comedian, you should be able to get a laugh at any time. You should just know how to do it. What makes great comedy, or made great comedy, because it's dead now, but what made great comedy was getting something more. Doing something more. I'm really going off now because it reminds me of like Richard Pryor's Live at the Sunset Strip. I think it was that one. It's the concert movie where he's dressed in red, and he does two amazing pieces in that show that I remember. I mean, I remember the whole show is amazing, but he does one piece that transcended comedy, and it's a story of when he got all those major degree burns from smoking heroin or whatever drug he was doing, and his life was in danger, and he talked about that going up into flames, and it was just an amazing piece. The other one was when he made a comparison between animals in the zoo and animals in the jungle, and it was an incredible piece about freedom. Now, when I say that stand-up comedy is dead, I'm not saying that laughter is dead. There was a lot of humor in each of these pieces, but they transcended that. It's interesting that the prize that they give, the Mark Twain Prize for comedy, they Mark Twain. Now, Mark Twain was someone that transcended merely being funny. True stories are going to have humor. They're going to have humor. One thing I admired about the director Mike Nichols was that the way he directed, and it was because of his background, because he was of the Compass Players, right, and Nichols and May and all that. He he could tell a very serious story, and he would always find those humorous accents in it because humor is part of truth and humor is part of reality. But something could be very, um, you know, if it's not funny, it's not fun. I don't even think about it. I don't try to avoid being funny, and I don't try to be funny when I write. I think most of my recent writing has not been that funny, but it's been the nature of what I've been writing. So the piece tells you what it's supposed to be, or the moment tells you what it's supposed to be. So I continue. I'm saying how I killed doing those shows, the show at the shithole and other shitholes with other names. And I was popular. Even at the place where they had issues with my anger, the audience, or at least a large portion of the audience, loved me. And I repeat again here, if you aren't angry, actually, we're past that anger moment now. The anger moment is when you're dawning on it and you're starting to build the boundary. Now we know what's up. So I'm not angry about Trump anymore and the Republicans. I'm determined. I was great at doing their shows, but it wasn't my work. So I learned I need spaces where I can work autonomously and speak my truth without the interference of other people's rules and expectations. And right now, the only space that I found is my own YouTube channel and my own blog. And that can change, and I'd be thrilled for it to change, but I'm just doing it. My commitment is to my work. It's not to any group. It's not to it's not to any other standard. I do it this way for a reason. I'm not here to please a particular audience. I'm here to provide it for the audiences that will find it edifying. And that's generally how it works. The included photo, which you have to see if you decide to look up this segment from the blog. The included photo was taken at my last performance to date by the bad stage manager, who is also a wonderful oracle. It's a picture of the future. Stand up comedy is dead. Long live beyond comedy. And it's interesting to me. I got the date right at the end because it's, the signature line, copyright 2018, Richard Thomas. Okay, so that's stand up comedy is dead. And now back to my correspondence with Rob, which adds a little bit more to the story of dealing with that director. The director that I refer to in my piece, who directed my last self-produced show, In a Manner of Speaking, I did it for invited friends, had directed Michael Moore, Sarah Silverman, and Bob Odenkirk. The show was in December 2017. In retrospect, that show was a major transitional point in my artistic development. The stand up segment tells why. I discovered the limits of, quote, comedy on stage in real time. I transcended that director as I discuss in the segment. And then I go into this. I regret that I said he was a nice guy. He wasn't a bad guy. I wouldn't call him nice. He was drawn to what I was doing and then wanted to limit it because he was scared. This is my take on the guy. A real uneasy art conservative. He ran away eventually, left me hanging, and I was very nice to him. It didn't hurt, thankfully, because I knew what was happening. I was being trolled by white nationalists online at the time, and he suggested that I ask them to the show. I told him that I didn't want a dialogue with fucking Nazis. He saw the audience as customers to be engaged. He was intrigued by my attitude while simultaneously shitting his pants. I was a lot more overtly political in that period. I don't regret it. It was good writing of the moment. But when I compiled my real writing in 2018, I didn't include that stuff. I try to get at the political from a different perspective now, much like movie reviews that I did during that time. Now I think my movie writing is more similar to what that's Rob's, old therapist was getting at. Hopefully amplification to the universal when it works. It was an interesting period. A lot of high level writing was peeking through the more obvious stuff. In my case, the best writing training is simply writing a lot. And I like these moments, this moment right now, where I assess the arc. That show, which was the last time I was on stage, has hints of what I'm doing now. So this is back to December 2017. Now, I'm not going to read the YouTube clip to this show because, there's no way that works on a YouTube clip. But if you put in quotation marks, Death of a Nation, and then put in quotation marks, the Rick blog, and then put video, you should be able to Google and pull up this show, the tape of this show, if you're so inclined to look at it. It runs probably about an hour and 10 minutes, this tape. Now, it's a work tape and it's shitty quality. It's the best of my writing to that point, December 2017. And I think I've grown a lot since then, but there's some good material in there too. I mean, I've actually going over the stuff in the blog. I'm interested how much stuff I look back at that I'm pretty happy with, a couple years later. Like even the act just now of reading that stand-up comedy is dead. I talked about certain little things that I would change, but generally, I think that's a pretty good piece. For me, a lot of my process has been addition by subtraction. I did a podcast for a while with a producer who added sound effects with a professional veneer. That was a lot of extraneous bullshit. And I like my current YouTube clips much more. Have a great day, Rob. Rick. Okay. So that's that. And this piece is copyright 2019, Richard Thomas.